Okay, I'm going to get going here. So welcome to those of you on Zoom, and then either Facebook Live if you pop in, or if you're watching this later, it's going to be recorded. But this is meant to be kind of a little informal session, a quick how-to on designing your own pollinator garden. With the work that we're doing here in the Curries Fork watershed in Oldham County, we talk a lot about pollinator gardens. So I just wanted to have brief sessions so that way anyone who's interested and maybe has some questions or a little apprehension on how to kind of jump in and get started, this is a good place to start. Okay, so who's our audience? So people who might be interested in this are anyone who likes to garden or admire plants, anyone interested in learning more about and taking actions to support nature, especially at home, anyone concerned about species decline, so like wildlife species decline or other environmental concerns, and then anyone who manages or has access to some land, so definitely homeowners as well as renters this could be applicable to you as well. And really just anyone who, hears the word pollinator and wants to know a little bit more. What to expect from today's workshop. So I'm aiming to provide you with a decent overview on how to plant a pollinator garden, design and plant one, to know where you can look for more information. Of course, there is so much information out there. This is not meant to be a college class. This is meant to be a really accessible informational session for the public to get you started. A few ways to get involved in the community, and then hoping to help you broaden your understanding of your part in helping the environment. So just a little bit about me. So I am not a professional landscape designer or a native plant expert. I have 10 plus years experience in the field of environmental science and natural resources conservation. So I work as the watershed coordinator for Oldham County, specifically for our Curries Fork watershed program. And my position focuses on working with the community to help reduce pollution and improve our local waterways. So planting native plants or pollinator gardens on private property is becoming increasingly important to support wildlife and mitigate pollution that reaches our waterways. So native plants, pollinators really connects to our goals on improving waterways. Personally, I love gardening and playing with native plants. And then, of course, professionally, as I said, there's huge applications with promoting native plants with the public. So again, this session is meant to provide a layman's understanding on how to design and plant a pollinator garden to those interested. I'm not aiming to get into the weeds, pun intended, or lay out any hard and fast rules. This is meant to be fun and educational and not meant to be, right and wrong and any of those types of rules. So I also believe that knowledge and finances should not be barriers to planting pollinator gardens. So if wherever you're coming from, whatever situation, the native plant community is very welcome, and we want you to join us, and we want to get you some plants and information and get you connected. Okay, so creating a pollinator garden, easy steps here, right? So choosing your location, preferably a sunny location, having a site for water for butterflies, bees, pollinators to drink, providing native plants. We're going to talk a little bit more about native plants. Providing native plants, milkweed is very important, and I'll tell you why in a second if you don't know. Choose plants that bloom at different times of the year. Grouping plants in odd numbers, just grouping them together in general, putting taller plants in the back, thinking about heights of plants is really important. Not forgetting to include trees and shrubs in your garden plans. Leaving areas mulch-free, leaving areas that don't have any vegetation, just maybe dirt where our solitary bees can nest. Don't use any type of chemicals or pesticides unless you really need to, being really conscientious about your chemical use. And thinking about composting if you're not already is also a really good practice. So an overview of what I'm going to get into, just a little bit about pollinators, making sure we're all on the same page of what I mean when I say pollinators. Again, getting into the basics of designing a pollinator garden and a little bit about community involvement and advocacy. Okay, pollinators. So before we really get into this, I just want to get the definitions out of the way. So definitions, there's some that are a little bit more specific and some that, depending on who you talk to, they might have a different view of it. Again, I'm not really going with any hard and fast rules here, but here's sort of where I'm coming from when I use certain terms. So native plants, typically native plants are considered those plants found in the United States before the Europeans came in and changed the landscape. We think of it this way because we think of native plants as being part of the balance of nature that have developed, these plants have developed with nature, with the conditions over hundreds of thousands of years to a particular region or ecosystem. Non-native would be a plant that would have been introduced to the area, to the country, wherever the specific location is. We're talking about they are not adapted to that location and they were brought in. So not all non-native plants are invasive. So many non-native plants are introduced to new places, they cannot reproduce or spread readily without continued human help. So some examples would be ornamental plants. A lot of us have like boxwoods in our yards. They're non-native, but they might not be considered an issue there. And then invasive plants, those are the plants when we think about more of that negative connotation. So a plant that is able to establish on many sites, grow quickly, does not work with the ecosystem, does not work with that balance that we're seeking, and they can spread to the point of disrupting plant communities and ecosystems. A pollinator is just anything that can carry pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, which allows for that plant to reproduce with fruit, seeds, and then more plants. A cultivar is an organism, so in this case we're talking about plants. Typically a cultivar is a plant that was, humans came in and either through agriculture or horticulture variety adjusted some characteristics of that plant. So in a lot of cases, maybe the color of the plant, maybe the bloom type, and cultivars aren't necessarily bad to plant, but just being aware that a cultivar, there's some characteristics that were brought out in that plant specifically for human aesthetics and human value, and in that process, sometimes the ecological parts of that plant, so the ability for pollinators, bees, to access the food, the ability for that plant to grow abundant food, nectar or pollen, might have been diminished in that process. And weed, this is my favorite definition to tell people all the time. So weed is simply a plant that is not valued where it's growing. So we consider this a human term. It does not indicate ecological value. So you might have heard of milkweed's a great example, Joe Pye weed, these plants that often have the name weed in them as part of that name. They had that term because at some point they were so abundant they were considered weeds. But weeds are often more of an agricultural term. You know, if you're growing a field of corn and you have a bunch of other grasses coming in, those are considered weeds. You don't want them there. But for your purposes in your yard, if that's a plant you want there, it is not considered a weed. Somebody else might see that plant in their yard and not want it there, and they do consider it a weed. So just so you know, feel more empowered now that you know the term weed if you didn't know that before. Okay, let's get moving. So pollinators. So pollinators, often we know bees and butterflies, but again, anything can be considered a pollinator or support pollination. So wasps, moths, beetles, flies, birds, bats. Oftentimes wind will help pollinate. Milkweed is a good example. If you think of the silk coming out of the milkweed pods, wind helps with that. And then people, so either purposefully or inadvertently, people can often help pollinate plants as well and move that pollen around. And again, pollination, when we talk about pollination, it's just from when, that grain moves from the anther or the male part of the flower to the stigma or the female part, and the pollination happens. And some plants are self-pollination, sometimes again wind can help, water, or through vectors such as those pollinators on the last slide of bees and butterflies often, as well as people. The importance of pollinators. So this could be a whole nother session in itself, but oftentimes Thinking about pollinators, people often hear about helping the bees first, and when they think about helping the bees first, they think about honeybees first. And honeybees are super great, and they are essential to agriculture. We rely on them for a lot of our food production, but we also want to think about other pollinators, other bees as well. So when we think about other aspects to the importance of pollinators, we want to think about not just a value for us as humans in supporting our agricultural production and our food, but we also want to think about how pollinators help birds. So in this little graphic here, I love this because it gets into the fact that birds rely on caterpillars to feed their young. And a baby clutch requires 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to grow from tiny birds to fledglings, which is pretty incredible. And where do caterpillars come from? So caterpillars survive by eating plants, and preferably native plants, the plants that they're adopted to eat. Some caterpillars can only eat one plant. And so a lot of people have heard of the monarch butterfly, they've heard it's in trouble, but they might not know that one of the reasons it's in so much trouble is because the monarch caterpillar can only eat milkweed. So if you want to support the monarch caterpillar, you want to plant milkweed. And there's other plants, other caterpillars like that are specialists. We consider them specialists, where they can only eat, one or two species of native plant. And then there's a lot of generalists out there too. But kind of what I'm getting at is that without the native flowers, you don't have the caterpillars, and then you don't have the birds. So if you've heard about birds and their declining species as well, it's all connected. Okay. So I did mention there's a lot of different bees out there. So of course, honeybees are not native; they're from Europe, but we do rely on them here in the United States for our food production. But there's almost 4,000 species of native bees in the United States. And about a third of them, three-quarters of them are considered solitary bees. So when you think about honeybees, you're thinking about nesting bees, bees working together in a colony. But most bees actually live by themselves. And I mentioned keeping an area open where you're not mulching it, keeping kind of some vegetation, some just dirt exposed. So a lot of solitary bees will actually nest in the ground over winter. So there's different considerations there of helping other bees. And this just helps with diversity, thinking about we have so many bee species who provide such different support, work together in balance. And so when we want to help bees, we want to help the honeybees, but we want to keep in mind that there's a lot of other bees that are really beneficial to our ecology here and that need our help as well. And so briefly, pollinators in decline. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. The main reasons why our pollinators are in decline, there's of course, the invasive pests and diseases. Pesticides and chemicals are a really big concern. Loss of habitat is a concern. Loss of species and genetic diversity to really adapt to things like climate change. And I kind of highlighted here loss of habitat because that's really the biggest factor in our pollinators being declined, and that's also something that we can all help with. So pollinator-friendly practices here. We've got plant natives, right? So plant natives, native plants are most adapted to the conditions here, and the pollinators and the wildlife that we want to support have adapted alongside with these plants. So planting natives. Thinking about diversity, again, I'm going to repeat myself a lot here, but just know that. So avoiding using pesticides, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but avoid modern cultivars and hybrids. So I guess I can mention now, cultivars aren't necessarily bad, but just again being aware that if you want to kind of choose the best plant and get the best bang for your buck, I'll use that term, then the native plants are really going to be the way to go. Thinking about host plants, so for example, the milkweed is a host plant for the monarch caterpillar, so thinking about those associations. Providing source of water, and then creating nesting opportunities. So I mentioned keeping ground cover open. You can also create like mason bee houses and create little areas. A lot of stems leaving stems. So a lot of stems actually are hollow inside, and then little bees find their way in those and they overwinter. So thinking about that as well. And of course, we're focused on the plants today and gardens. Thinking again, about these native plants. So we often get overwhelmed, right, with the amount of things to be concerned about in our environment. But native plants are a really wonderful way to kind of step in and say, what can I do? What can I get involved with that's reasonable with, my time, my finances, my interests, and feel good about what you're doing, because native plants, they help our waterways, they support wildlife. They provide wonderful erosion control. They have really, really deep roots that slow down stormwater and filter pollutants before they make it to our waterways. And they are just wonderful parts of our ecosystem and to creating resilience in our landscapes. Okay, so garden basics. So thinking about food in your garden, having food for both the butterflies and the caterpillars, having shelter and nesting sites, protection from pesticides, and then getting to the point where you feel comfortable engaging with your community and maybe being an advocate for planting native plants. Okay, the basics of designing a pollinator garden. Okay, sorry, 1 second here. The basics of designing a pollinator garden. So you want to assess your site, you want to select plants, you want to map your site and also map design, site design. You want to source your plants, preparing your site, planting your site, and then maintaining your site. So kind of the first step is to look at your yard or wherever you're thinking about planting and determine where would you like to create a pollinator garden. Where are you okay just having an area that's gonna go through this transition of looking a little bit different throughout the year, maybe not always looking exactly the way that you would like it to look, and where you're ready to not mow probably grass anymore. So thinking about sunlight, soil, moisture levels, wind exposure, or other environmental related concerns. If you're in a more rural area, or a lot of places like in Oldham County, we have a lot of deer here, so thinking about deer pressure, there are definitely native plants that are deer resistant. So if that was going to be your question, there are those. And then aesthetics is a big one. I'm not going to really get into aesthetics today because aesthetics is a personal decision, but just knowing that a lot of times people don't go the route of planting pollinator gardens and planting native plants because they look a little different, and they, if you have picky neighbors or you live in an HOA, that could be a point of contention. So that's where you're going to want to design your garden to just be a little bit more, I'll say, like neat and tidy. Okay. So again, assessing your site, I'm just going to go over these 4 main things: moisture, sunlight, nutrients, and temperature. So moisture, so when you're thinking about the plants that you want to put in your garden, you want to purchase, you want to get, thinking about that site. So when it rains, so we've had a lot of rain lately, when it's raining or just after a rain is really the best time to go out in your yard and see where you've got wet soil, where maybe you've got some erosion happening, and saying, that's a really good site to plant things, because one, planting lawn in really wet sites, I'm sure as you can imagine, does not go over. You keep creating ruts, you keep trying to mow an area that just really doesn't want to be lawn. So that's a great site to bring in some native plants. But then you want to make sure when you go to purchase native plants that they're plants that can handle that inundation of water. They can handle a little bit, they're more moisture tolerant. And then you might have areas in your yard that are always very dry. So with the same token, keeping looking at saying this area is dry. When I go to pick my plants, I want those plants to have those characteristics of being dry. So you might know this, trying to reach everybody where they're at here. But when you do go to purchase a plant or to obtain a native plant, you're going to be able, usually they have tags, or you can talk to the nursery owner and they'll be able to tell you, the plants that can handle different moisture conditions. But typically on tags, you'll see, like the plant name, sun requirements, moisture requirements. So these are all the things that you want to think about before you actually go to put plants in the ground. And then the same thing with sunlight. So one thing that I learned that was new to me was that full sun is really only about 6 hours of sun. So obviously in the summer here in Kentucky, we get a lot more than 6 hours of full sun. So you might have some areas that, get a little morning shade or afternoon shade from trees, or maybe shadow from your house or something like that. That doesn't mean that you can't put full sun plants there. And they might actually do really well, especially in the scorching summer heats when it does get really dry here. And then for native plants, you're going to have the most options when it comes to the full sun and partial sun sites. But if you've got sites that, handle maybe get just a couple hours of sun, they're mostly just shade sites, there are plenty of options for you as well. And usually they're going to be spring ephemerals and plants that you'd find like in woodlots where there's still remnant wildflowers still available. So you've got options. One of really the best characteristics about native plants is they are adapted to our soil here. So you really don't need, and in fact it might be detrimental to the growth of your native plants to put fertilizer. So if you can imagine, typically, you're going to plant, you carve out your hole for your plant. A lot of people will, shake in a little nutrients or fertilizer. But what that does for plants, especially native plants, is now you're creating this nice little home for those roots, and you're giving them everything they need immediately, and they've got no incentive to create bigger roots and dig down deeper. And when you have strong roots, you have a healthy plant. So we want to avoid nutrients and save it, and that saves you time and money at the same time. So in thinking about temperature, it's always important to kind of just have a broad sense of we don't want to plant tropical plants. We want to plant plants that are going to do well, and temperature is obviously a big factor there. So often I'd refer to the plant hardiness zone map. This is a USDA map. It was last updated to my knowledge in 2012. And so Oldham County, and this is, it's a map based on the average annual minimum temperature. And so we're usually, it might be changing a little bit, I think, just from climate change, but we're typically about a 6A or a 6B, as in, the annual minimum, the extreme temperature that the plant can handle would be about -10 to -5. And of course, I don't know the last time any of those temperatures happened, but that's just saying that all the plants in this region, if we had for some reason a huge temperature dip, those plants are going to be okay. So we don't want to get too far outside of that, or you'd be thinking about trying to do something else to keep those plants a little bit warmer in the winter. But on the same token, hotter temperatures too, thinking about the other end of that as well. Okay, so a little bit more about selecting plants, and of course I can't get into this as much as, we can't spend all day, but kind of thinking about where do you start. Native plants, hopefully I've conveyed well enough, native plants are definitely the best way to go. Non-natives and cultivars can be okay and even can be good. So an example that I would use for that, when you're going to plant your garden, you're typically going to use a lot of perennials. So it takes, a year, 2, 3 years for that to fill in, for you to have nice blooms. But if you want to help pollinators right away, annuals are a good supplement in the meantime. And they also help suppress weeds. So if you do a mix of perennials and annuals, that can be really wonderful to have good blooms the first year, suppress weeds so there's a little less maintenance going in as your perennials start to grow. Zinnias are a really great example. They're wonderful flowers that grow really well, provide plenty of food for pollinators. But they're non-native, but they're non-invasive, and they'll stay right where they are and do a great job, and you can harvest tons of seeds and grow those year after year. Keep clear of invasives, especially invasive non-natives. So it's really unfortunate in Kentucky and in a lot of states that it's really, the onus is really on the consumer to be careful of the plants that you're getting, because some states now do have bans on plants, and Kentucky is not really one of those. So you can still buy, oftentimes I see like winter creeper, you can buy English ivy, you can buy barberry, and all these other invasive plants that you know, if you just kind of walk around, you see them everywhere, and it's really sad that that's something people are selling and people are buying, and it's really detrimental to our landscapes. So just keep an eye out on those, and know that just because it's not a good plant doesn't mean that you can't find it in a store. Bush honeysuckle, so especially now in the spring, the first thing that greens up along our highways, you know, it's exciting, the weather's getting nicer, and then you just look down the highway and it's all just that green honeysuckle that really just takes over. It puts a toxin in the ground that prevents other things from growing around it, and it's just kind of nasty stuff. So if you've got that in your yard, I'm not going to talk about invasive management, but if you've got some invasives in your yard, that's also a good thing to start thinking about how to get rid of those. But you don't need to, I'd say, you know, plant to the extent you're comfortable. It's okay to dive in. It's okay to not plant a whole lot. You know, everybody's different. So kind of, if you're somebody that likes to plant a lot, definitely you can do that. But if you're somebody that, you know, don't feel like you have to have all the information, you have to have it all planned out before you kind of dive in, because it's fun and it's gardening and it's meant to be just a learning experience. And for many like myself, it's really, you know, your therapy. I can say that if you're a little unsure of your different plants, you can't go wrong with just going to a native plant nursery. You know they're all natives, and that's a really great option as well. And then seed swaps are also something that is becoming more readily available. Okay. So I'm going to get into kind of different plant lists. So there is all this information out there with plant lists. So if you're somebody that says, okay, I get natives are the best, let's do natives. Now I say, which natives? Well, thinking back to how certain plants are going to support certain species of pollinators, this is called the Top 100 list, and this was put together by the National Wildlife Foundation. And so in our region, this is a ranking of the top plants. So for example, oaks is number one. If you have space in your yard for one tree, you know, I would go with an oak, because an oak is going to support 346 species of butterflies and moths. So thinking about, you know, depending on your aim and your goal of extent that you're concerned about, you know, something looking good compared to something that's going to help wildlife, this is just another resource in the toolbox to think about if you're kind of debating, you know, what type of tree you plant or wildflower. Okay, so best practices. So it's really best to plant, you're starting to put plants in the ground, you're starting to bring some pollinators, increase the wildlife that's happening in your yard. But if you only put plants in your yard that bloom in the summer, you're missing the border season. So you're missing supporting the wildlife in the spring and the fall. So we want to plant for the 3 seasons, because things are going to bloom throughout the year. So keeping in mind plant for blooms in the spring, summer, and fall. Oftentimes there are less options for spring blooms, so that is where the trees and the shrubs can kind of fill those gaps as well. Generally planting multiple of something is very helpful. So if you want to plant, you know, like 3 to 5 to 6 of a wildflower, put them kind of in a space together so they can sort of start to grow together and support each other as those stems grow, because some stems are going to be kind of floppy and some aren't going to take up a big area, and it all just depends. But it's generally just best practice to, if you really want one certain flower, plant a few of those in an area together. And here's an example of that in kind of one of those lists and pictures. So this is a 3-season garden. So this is a really nice little list here where you have options both in spring, summer, and fall. You've got different bloom. You've got the colors here that it's provided. You've got a little diagram on, you know, where you would plant. I'll note in this diagram that These plants are planted offset, so you've got, and this is kind of best practice for planting in general, just to make sure as everything fills in together, it just looks a little nicer to have plants that, if you do rows, they're offset rows. That's really helpful. I'm trying to think what else might be important to point out here. I think I'm trying to also just point out that these, you don't have to come up with all this on your own. If you want to, for sure, go ahead, but there's so many lists available that you can literally just take this list right here and then make sure it makes sense to your site conditions. And that was just really pretty, so I'm going to move on now. So again, for those who prefer to do more planning, I would say don't get too caught up in the planning of it, because it does take a really long time to fill out your garden, and it's, you know, it's not a one and done thing. So you know, keep planning, but also don't wait too long. And I've got a couple of examples of lists here as well. So this is a list based on bloom period. So again, hitting different plants between, you know, the March and October time frames. We've got trees, we've got different wildflowers, and this doesn't have shade conditions. I think I've got another one with that, but I'm looking at different shade conditions on these. Let's go to the next one here. So this one also has bloom period, scientific name. That will be important, especially if you're going to say like a box store and you want native plants. Sometimes they do have native plants, and you can look at the scientific name on those tags to determine, because there are a lot of cultivars and it's really easy to kind of overlook the native plant aspect of things. So looking at the scientific name will be helpful. Again, bloom color. This chart has height, which is really nice. So thinking about where you're planting things, where you're okay with something being tall. If you're a little bit newer to native plants, some of these plants get really tall, and so that's where grouping them together will be really helpful for that support. But also, maybe you don't want to put a 7-foot tall plant, you know, in your front yard. That's okay, but just being aware when you purchase those plants, or you plant those 7-foot tall plants, that means it's going to take about 6 feet of growth before you get a bloom. So flowers are the prettiest part, right? So making sure you're okay with having, you know, a tall stalk that's growing up until it blooms. Let's see, water needs. That's really nice. This has water needs. When it comes to native plants, one thing that's also wonderful about them is once they establish, so after kind of the first year, they really don't need any water. Again, they're established to our current growing conditions. So as long as you didn't put, you know, a wetland plant in an area in your yard that never dry, that, you know, is always dry, then you're good to go after that first season. You don't have to worry about spending money on, you know, running the faucet to water them, and that's really wonderful. And then this list is also nice because it gives some characteristics, you know, different. This is a host plant for this plant, and a little bit more information to get into the wildlife support side. And here's another, and I'm going to send all this out in these links, but here's just another one. So if you're looking online, this might be something that you can look for as well. And I don't think there's anything on this that's new characteristics. But just pointing out there's abundance of resources out there. So other lists here, so these are really nice, these types of lists. So for example, sunny rain garden kit. So if you have an area, you know, rained, you went outside and this, you know, you see an area that's wet for a couple days, maybe you want to create a rain garden or at least plant rain garden plants. Here's some examples there. If you've got a shadier spot, a spring woodland kit, this list here. And then this bottom one is 3-season pollinators already right there for you. And I'll point out, this is a really good example of how you know if something is a cultivar. So cultivars are going to have the name of the plant, and then they're going to have a name in quotes. So this one, you know, dark towers, October skies, fireworks, that is the cultivar name. So if you're trying to stay away from cultivars, then you will just want to pay attention to that when you buy your plants. Okay. So sourcing plants, so where to buy. This is a really great resource that I would recommend. So the Kentucky Native Plant Society. that is a state available resource where they have a whole list of native plant nurseries in Kentucky. So if you want to kind of go the route of just going to a native plant nursery, you want native plants, you don't want to worry about cultivars or invasive plants, then I would definitely recommend checking out that list at the Kentucky Native Plant Society there. And then Indiana also has a lot of resources. This map is from Indiana, so there are a couple close to the Louisville area in Indiana that you could go to as well. We talked a little bit about buying plants. So looking at these different names. Coneflower, so echinacea, that's going to be a big one, that there are a lot of cultivars of echinacea. And again, not necessarily not going to help pollinators, but just being aware of that. And then a big one here that I will talk about for a second. So you might have heard of neonicotinoids, or this is a pesticide that is can be put on plants because of people trying to sell plants that they have aphids or some other type of insect that's eating them. So you don't want to go to sell something that by the time it gets to the store, it's already been eaten, right? So the solution for that for a lot of growers and suppliers is putting pesticides. Now this is preferably you want to avoid plants that have neonicotinoids because they the whole plant holds this. It's a poison, and the whole plant holds it. So not only is it going to be harmful for the insects that people don't want eating the plants, but it's going to be harmful for the pollinators. So if you end up getting a plant that has pesticides on it, you just want to avoid any pollinators getting to it for a couple years, and that would involve cutting it before it blooms. Of course, best practice is just to avoid this altogether. Some people will tell you just avoid the box stores. I've heard some things recently about stores, like the big box stores, getting away from using these pesticides, which is really great. But the best thing to do would be you could ask a sales associate, or most places are going to have their pesticide policy on their website, and they'll tell you which plants that they still use pesticides on and which they don't. And that's kind of a safety measure that you could use. But again, simplest thing would be, of course, to avoid kind of those options as well. But going to a native plant nursery isn't always accessible to everybody. You know, you're going to Home Depot or whatever to pick something up. You want to go get a plant, and then you get concerned that, oh, did I get the wrong plant? Does it have poison on it? So there are things you can do, and I'm hopeful that as we move forward, this will just be less of a concern, hopefully. Okay, design basics. So let's see. We've talked about this. So select the variety of blooms, both to support the larvae, the caterpillars, the butterflies, the moths, all stages of the life cycle. Consider the growing habits of the plant. So again, thinking about height. Also good to think about the kind of spreading conditions. This is, of course, going to be a harder one to know ahead of time, but this is where you could ask like a nursery owner or associate. Some plants, even if they're native, they do really well spreading into a site. That can be a really good thing, but you don't want to plant those next to maybe the more delicate plants that are gonna take a few more years to establish. So part of this, I mean, for me personally, part of this is like the fun of it, to see these different conditions, but just something to be aware of ahead of time. But no, there's always these little intricacies that are gonna come up. A more economical option is to, of course, get smaller plants to begin with. If you're getting trees, trees take a long time to grow, of course. So if you can get taller trees to begin with, of course you can do that. But smaller gallon sizes are fine too. Thinking about where you're putting your taller plants again, either in the back or in the middle. If you've got some really nice shorter plants, they might get shaded out, or you just might not see them from your point of view if you've got them behind the tall plants. Moisture loving plants, says save on your water bills. Again, I don't think you need to worry about your water bills with native plants, because once they're established, they really should be good to go. You shouldn't need to water. Thinking about color, so there's a lot of plants that are yellow, a lot that are pink, a lot that are purple. So do you want them together, spread out? things like that. And that's, again, the aesthetic side of things. Always good to leave a little bit of a border for mulch or something else. Some people put up little fencing, and just have a little area, especially as you're getting into starting to grow your garden. If you have a little border between where you're, say, mowing your lawn and where you're growing your plants, that's helpful. I know it's helpful for me to maintain that space and to know, this is where my lawnmower goes, this is where it stays away, because the grasses and the weeds will start to kind of creep in. And just one note, that the importance of grass. So of course we all want those beautiful flowers, but grasses are really essential, both to fill in spaces between flowers, to hold up some of those smaller, taller flowers. They bunch up together, so that can help to fill quite a bit of space as well, and kind of fill in your garden sooner. And they also provide habitat over winter and food for a lot of wildlife. So really don't forget the grasses when you're planning out your garden. So I'd recommend, if you're going to actually lay out a plan, to measure the site and to get some graph paper. And I would recommend doing it to a scale that makes sense for you. Typically, one box on the graph paper would be 1 foot, and just doing it, you could be as, I don't tell people to be meticulous about it, because I know I'm not that way, but of course you can be as detailed and meticulous as you want to. But just good practice to get a general sense before you, especially if you're going to go and buy a lot of plants at once, to feel good about, the end product. And like Plant List, there are so many templates already available if you want to use them. I have a couple here. So one here, you can see they're grouping plants together. This one doesn't even have any measurements on it, but they're grouping plants together. So I can see they've got sunflowers, mums, Joe Pye weed. So I know Joe Pye weed is a really tall one. Sunflowers are typically tall. They've got, let's see, some catmint. So they've got herbs. Herbs are typically not native. Mint can be very aggressive if you've played with mint. Some others can be very aggressive, but herbs are really wonderful to support pollinators, and that's where sticking to just natives is something. If you want to do, great, but don't forget herbs. And then, of course, if you use herbs in your home, that's a really nice kind of dual purpose there. But some shorter things here. Lavender is really great, has really great blooms for pollinators. So there's something like that. And then Lexington, they put together all these lists as well. So this is a partial shade front yard. They've got a bunch of other ones. So this is really nice if you want to just pull one of these and kind of take a look at the different species they have and work your way off from there. So one thing with something like this, if you want to take one of these existing plans, what you can do is you can kind of backtrack. So for example, I'll go with this purple coneflower because that's a really common one. So they've got purple coneflower on this. I would go and look and see, okay, where's the purple coneflower? And then if I wanted to put that in my yard, I would make sure that the growing conditions in my yard matched well with the growing conditions of purple coneflower. So coneflower typically grows about 2 to 3 feet. It is a bit more bunching, and it does spread pretty well. It's typically found in rain gardens, but it handles both wet and drier conditions. It's very versatile. But I'd start to think about those your site assessment characteristics and kind of, like I said, work your way back from there. All right, I'm going to go through a quick example here, and then we're almost done, and I'll leave some time for questions. So if you aren't aware, through our Curry's Fork program, we're working with the LaGrange Library to plant a pollinator garden. And so what I did here was I took the space that we're planting right in front of the library, and I designed a pollinator garden outline here. And what do I want to say? So the library received this national grant, and we had an event a couple weeks ago, a kickoff event, but they've gotten seeds to give out. We're gonna plant this garden. We're going to have some bio blitzes, which is getting outside, basically getting more doing some nature walks, identification of plants and wildlife outside. So bio blitzes, we're going to do that later this year. We did a seed swap last year with our program. We're going to keep doing that and kind of make it a whole cycle of planting gardens, collecting seeds, giving seeds out. And if you haven't been to the library, I encourage you to get over there, especially after we plant this garden. But I learned that the library, so it's a LEED certified building, and this actually used to be a rain garden. Now, if anybody has pictures of it, please send them to me. I'd love to see what it looked like. But it used to be a rain garden, so it's got this drainage way here, and then it just wasn't maintained. So, of course, preference would be for it still to be maintained as a rain garden, but second option, which we have here, is it's ready to be planted. So we didn't have to do any site prep. It's already looking good here. Okay. So when I was thinking about assessing this site, this is actually a north-facing site. So I'm trying to be a little bit more careful about putting plants that are going to be full sun. Now, they might do okay, but I wanted to get into the more like part shade groupings of plants for this because it's north-facing. I mentioned the rain garden, so I want to stick to plants that can handle that inundation when it rains. I don't know exactly how moist the soil stays when it rains. I'm not sure, so to be safe, I just want to stick to those plants that can handle that inundation for a day or two. There's some existing trees and shrubs that are going to stay there, so I want to work around those. And then, because this is a community space, I want to be careful to have this be more of the neat and tidy look and less of the wild and woolly look. I also want to be considerate and that we want this to be a space for the community. We want this to be a space for education and kids to explore. So a consideration with people walking through it and it providing a space for educational events as well. Okay, and this is, I took a overshot here, a screenshot, measured it out, so I'm looking at about an 800 square foot area, and then this is a picture of my initial map. So I used that graph paper, and I went to the site, I measured it out, I put in the existing features, so that gravel drainage, the trees, the shrubs, and then I was thinking about how I want to lay this out. So I want the tallest plants to be towards the back because I don't want them to, one shade is going to be an issue here. I don't want them to shade out the shorter plants. And I also want people to see the blooms on the shorter ones. So initially I was looking at putting all of this blue mist flower in the front, and then some people I talked to, I didn't do this all by myself, some people I talked to, and it's always good to have somebody you can kind of relay, go back and forth if you're making a plan. And if anybody wants me to look at something for them, just please reach out. I'm happy to look at something with you and help you as much as I can. So originally I was going to do a blue mist flower, which is a really cute blue flower that I learned about last year. And then somebody told me it actually gets really aggressive. So then I was kind of rethinking that. I'll get to the next one here in a second. And then I was trying to do some bunches together with a grass in the middle of some of these areas. So thinking about coneflower, which all of these do well with a little bit of rain, precipitation, and they can handle their roots being inundated. Brown-eyed Susan, river oats, that's a good one, blue lobelia, elephant's foot, and then kind of some groupings of both flowers and grasses in the back. So New England aster is a really beautiful flower. It's got a purple flower, doing some pockets of little blue stem, which is a really nice grass. Milkweed, we always want to have milkweed for our monarch butterflies, and then bee balm. And then over here, thinking about keeping that neat and tidy look, so shrubs really help with that. Something like swamp hibiscus, which can handle the rain garden situation, but gets to be kind of like a beautiful shrub, or putting shrubs. So I color coded this a little bit because one thing that might happen is you have your plan and then you go to the nursery and they don't have what you want in stock. But if you know that, okay, I want something here that's a little bit short and compact and can handle part shade, the nursery owner can help you kind of figure out an alternative that works well for you, that you might not have to wait till the next growing season. And here I want you all to see this. to see the different components here. So the plant list, making sure to clarify, you know, this is a rain garden situation, the sizing, my intentions of having short plants, mid-height plants, taller plants, and special thanks to Margaret Shea of Dropseed Nursery, where she kind of helped me reorganize this a little bit and provide some alternatives. So I guess I don't have the final plant design here, but it is going to be very similar, and I'll send that out later as well. One thing I didn't mention on the last slide is I want this to be a space that people can walk through. Maybe you bring your kids and you can kind of play, especially with having milkweed around. It's really cool to go, you know, poke your head in and see if there's any chrysalises or caterpillars eating the milkweed. So if we can get some stones kind of between, or some type of walkway between some of these plants, that'll just make it a much more accessible, and also just give that more community feel and inviting feel of walking through. So preparing the site, so there's a few ways to do this. Solarization, sod removal, you can burn the site and you can use herbicide. If you've got the time, I'd recommend the solarization, and that is where you're just going to cover your site. It's best done in the summer when it's hot, but you can cover your site with either cardboard, works really great, we've all got cardboard around, or some type of plastic. Cover it for a few weeks, take it up, and then let the existing seed bed regrow, because you've got a lot of existing seeds in your soil and you want to reduce your weed pressure later on. So the sooner that those seeds grow, the less you'll have to deal with later. Of course, it's not a perfect system, but you can cover your site, wait a few weeks, lift up your plastic or cardboard, let those plants grow, and then put the cardboard or plastic back on. And it's best to plant in the fall. Of course, planting in the spring, we all do it because we love to plant, but planting in the fall is the best time. So if you know now where you want to, or you can figure out soon where you want to plant, you can start that solarization process throughout the summer, and then long term you'll just be much more successful and have less issues with weeds. You can also just go in and remove the sod. If you've got a big area, you could do this with a sod cutter, or get some friends to come help you, or you can get a shovel and just kind of dig it up on your own. That's also an option. Burning, that's going to be less of an option for people, but that is still a great option to go and burn the site. And then you can also use herbicide. And if you use herbicide, I would just be careful. Make sure you've got the information you need to be able to do that. Understand that the chemicals that we buy in stores, they're very concentrated, so you always want to make sure you're diluting any chemicals that you get. And then just being careful of any runoff from that site, and if you've got any plants around, and those kind of considerations. But definitely a good option for some people that will work well. Okay, timing. So I did already mention this briefly, but with our area, it's really best to plant in the October through kind of January time. Oh, I'm sorry, November through February. I highlighted the wrong thing here. Apologize about that. It's best to plant November through February. So all of our perennial plants, they are adapted to our conditions, and of course it freezes in Kentucky in the winter. So the seeds from these plants are adapted to getting those frost temperatures. And so if you're putting down seeds in the spring and they haven't gone through cold temperatures, they might not grow until a whole nother year. So keep that in mind, that it's okay to put seeds down sooner, but it just requires, that patience is something that you'll just want to keep in mind. You can provide these seeds with artificial winter by putting them in your freezer or in your fridge in moist sand for a few months, and that'll help. But if you're going to plant and you've got the time, fall is just going to be the best time, because it also helps to plant plants in the fall, because they can get established and then they're going into dormancy. It's just much more stressful for the plant to be moved around as it's starting to grow in the spring. Okay, so assuming you've got a design, you've got your plants, I advise kind of laying out your plants in your site before you go to plant. You've prepped your site. If you're putting mulch down, I found it's easiest to put the mulch down first and move that mulch around before you put your plant in. You can also put the mulch down after, works fine. But lay out your plants, lay them out. I don't think I did mention this, but lay them out and plant design that where you have at least 1.5 feet, 2 feet between your plants. Oftentimes, just because it can take a while for plants to establish, we want to put plants really close together, and that's okay. But it can become kind of wasteful because now that each plant has less space and less resources to grow and be healthy. So just keeping in mind, if you minimize your spacing, then the plants are likely going to struggle a little bit more to get established. So 1.5 to 2 feet apart, even 3 feet, just depending on your space. Planting, so make your hole, you want to have the roots completely covered in the hole. You don't want to have your stem of your plant covered. I'm probably not explaining this well. I feel like everybody's planted something, but just being considerate of making sure your roots are nicely in the ground and the top of your plant is above the ground. Again, these are native plants, so they can handle what you put at them for the most part. You can water. I'd recommend watering right away, and at least for the first little bit, first few weeks, depending on what the weather conditions are. And then it's always fun when you plant something, especially I've noticed with the native plants, if you plant it and go back, every couple days, start to pull up on the plant, you'll see very quickly how quickly these plants establish. And that's a really awesome feeling to, put something in the ground and know it's already got roots attached to that soil. So that works very quickly. Definitely be careful about putting too much mulch. You don't want to mulch over your plants. And thinking about providing space for those solitary bees as well. Just leaving space where I'd put maybe 1 inch or 2 of mulch. I wouldn't go too crazy. Kind of the last piece here, so maintaining your garden. So it does take a while, depending on what a while means to you, for these plants to establish. If you're used to kind of the typical annual plants that are blooming right away that get put out before Derby, this is not that situation. This is something that the best blooms are going to be about 3 seasons down the road. So have patience. It is, much more satisfying, I think, to have these types of gardens for many reasons. But keep an eye out on weeds, and again, that's going to be your preference to how much do you want to go out and check on them and weed them, and figure out the extent there that you're willing to spend time on it. Once you put those plants in the ground, especially during any type of growing season, especially as these plants are growing, please don't put any weed killers or fertilizers or pesticides. Especially, right now, you probably noticed some bees are out, so we want to really avoid extra harm to those plants that can impact the pollinators. When to cut back. So this is really your preference. Best practice would be wait till the following spring. So this picture on the right, these are old stalks here. A lot of them are, the stalk comes up, then it browns. I think they get to be really nice shades of orange and browns. If you're okay with that in your yard, then leave it, because that's going to provide really nice nesting and overwintering and seeds for wildlife. If you want to cut it back, you can do that. Maybe just leave those stalks on the ground or move them somewhere else in your yard. But really best practice is to wait until that new growth comes up, which is really happening, starting about now, but really between, April and May. Let's see, I'm not going to really talk much about compost, and I think we covered the maintenance there. This picture here, so this is our Welcome Center Pollinator Garden in LaGrange, and this is a space where we have a little pollinator garden. And I like to bring people out here, encourage them to go check this out. Every week I'm out here, every time I check it out, it looks different. It's really exciting to see something grow up. So if you're a visual person and you're not sure about what plants you might want to use or what something's going to look like, if you want an example, just go to the LaGrange Welcome Center and you can see some things growing there. But we planted in October 2019, and this last picture here, July 2021, so this was 2 years later. And these plants are still filling in, so you can get a sense that it does take time. And this year is going to be the best year yet with how much those plants have filled in. But they're doing really well. There's so many other resources out there. There's something like this. This is a checklist. The Xerces Society is a really great resource for all things pollinators that I'd recommend. But if you're, somebody who I want to make sure I have the full list of like what I'm doing and what to keep in mind, this is something that's really great. Kind of thinking about plant native, make sure I've got my different seasons. You can check it off. And that can work really well for some people. I know I like to have a to-do list sometimes, and obviously the satisfaction of checking something off feels really great. And this list goes on, but I just have a small clip of it. And planting your garden, so just think like a pollinator. Again, you know, there are best practices, but, you know, I don't want to say there's no wrong way to do it, but there's a lot of right ways to do it, I think would be a good way to say that. So if you're in your yard and you're looking around and thinking about what to do, just think about, you know, this is talking about bees, but if you're helping bees, you're probably helping other pollinators too. So think like a bee and what would help bees, and know that if you have kind of that thought in mind of helping nature and helping bees, then you're on the right track, and there's resources and people out there who would be happy to help you and answer questions and to reach out. And the last little bit here, so community involvement and advocacy. This is definitely becoming more readily accessible and available to people who are interested in getting involved. Just one slide here about habitat signs and certification. If you're able to, I'd recommend getting some type of sign. We might have some through our program at some point. We don't just yet, but having a sign, you know, pollinator zone or habitat or something like that, just to kind of mark your pollinator garden, and that also helps too if you've got some picky neighbors or people in your circle that might be questioning what you're doing. That can help, because ultimately, you know, we don't want to tell people what to do, but if we can have a nice garden and then somebody comes up and says, oh, that looks nice, what is that? Well, maybe, you know, that can be a way to connect with people and help spread the pollinator awareness. And then I had mentioned we're planting a garden at the LaGrange Library on May 3rd. We need about 10 to 15 people. I do have a few people who told me they're interested, but if you would like to come help, please do. Just let me know. I'll send out these links later, but you can just send me an email to say you're interested, and I'll get you on my list and remind you on that day. Pollinators, planting pollinator plants, planting native plants in gardens. It's something everybody, for the most part, can do. It's really great for kids. I do love when people bring their kids out, and that's just a really great experience. So this is for anybody interested. And then I'm also slowly building a list of just volunteers, as we have gardens to maintain and tree plantings and different things. So if you're interested on being on that list, I avoid oversending emails, but just the good information I try to send out. Then I'll send out this link as well, but you can get on that list and be notified if there's events coming up. And then, I don't think I mentioned it here, we also have our Facebook group, Friends of Curry's Fork, and I put things on Facebook as well if you're on Facebook. And with that, I know I'm a little late, got into talking about some other things, but thank you so much. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and just see if anybody has any questions, but I really appreciate your time, and hopefully I've provided some helpful information for you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Any thoughts or questions? Check Facebook too. Okay. Well, if not, I'm going to follow up with some information and my contact information, but please reach out if you have any questions, and I hope this was helpful, and have fun planting your pollinator gardens.